One of the most important considerations for technical writing is word choice. Word choice goes beyond making sure you're using the right technical terms. You also have to consider using the right non-technical terms. Remember, the number one rule of technical writing is that no one wants to read what you wrote. If you use words that are too complicated, it'll be very difficult for someone to understand and essentially take them more time to read through your document. The number one rule of word choice, then, is don't try to sound smart. Be smart. Don't use complex words when simpler ones would do just fine. A very common tendency is to increase the complexity of the word, thinking that doing so will make the writing more formal. That is rarely the case. Remember that no one wants to read what you wrote. Have that always in the back of your mind. It's not cynical. What it means is you need to make sure that your writing is as clear as possible so that the person reading it can get on with their day. Here's a list of very commonly misused words. We see this a lot in student reports. The first one is utilize. Utilize doesn't mean what many people think it means. To utilize something means to take something and put it to a use that it was not intended for. For instance, I utilize my laptop as a doorstop. Use means to put something to the use it was intended for. I use my laptop to check my email. Humans versus people is another one. Humans is a scientific term. It's used sometimes when you actually mean the scientific species of humans. For instance, the human endocrine system, or if you're talking about measurements or proportions of the human head to the human arm. But usually what you mean is the word people. Humans don't utilize computers. People use computers. Endeavor is just a longer way of saying the word try. The word thus is older. It makes your writing sound much more formal, much more dusty, almost like you took it out of an old book. You can either avoid it entirely. Most of the time it's implied that one sentence comes after another and perhaps it's using its conclusions. But you might also want to say because of or since. Implement is a one where if you use it correctly, it's perfectly fine. The algorithm was implemented. Perfectly acceptable. However, sometimes it makes your writing sound very strange. The robot implemented the path. The robot implemented the instructions. That's not really what you meant. The robot followed the path. The robot carried out the instructions. The word exponential isn't necessarily wrong, but it's very frequently misused. Exponential literally means a base raised to a power, e to the x, 2 to the 4th. If you mean the growth rate was exponential, then you should give actual numbers to prove that it was actually exponential. It could have been linear or quadratic. Generally speaking, technical writing is not the time to use colloquialisms, and exponential has become a colloquialism. If you mean to show that this is a particular growth rate, show that growth rate. Give numbers. Finally, the word optimize doesn't mean what many people think it means. Many people think optimize means we've tried our best. This is the best we can do. What it actually means is we have a criteria that we're evaluating this design against, and it literally can be no higher, or if it's, for example, the weight, no lower. Optimize means you've followed very strict procedures, you've done extremely precise measurements, and you've determined that this is the best that can be done. If you haven't done that, then you didn't mean optimize. Here are some examples. A linear distance measurement device was utilized to determine the size of the robot. Or, the robot was measured with a ruler. The second sentence might sound overly simplistic to you, but that's what was done. I took a robot, I took a ruler, and I measured it. The next one is a little more complicated. The following table outlines 11 essential engineering specifications that clearly elaborate on various characteristics, attributes, or design parameters. Alternatively, Table 1 describes 11 key specifications of the robot. The problem with the first sentence is that there's many words that shouldn't be there, and far too much description of what this table is going to give me. For instance, the word essential. If it wasn't essential, then it shouldn't be in the report. If it is essential, you shouldn't need to tell me. The word clearly. If your writing is clear, you don't need to tell me your writing is clear. I'll be able to see that by reading it. If you feel you need to tell me my writing is clear, then it is not clear. The word elaborate doesn't make sense here. Tables are usually used to summarize. Elaborate would mean that I've had a summary and then I'm adding more information. That's not what a table typically does. The word various is meaningless. You've already told me there are 11, so don't tell me it's various. Tell me there are 11. Finally, this word or is very problematic. This table elaborates on characteristics, attributes, or design parameters. Well, which one is it? Did you mean and, so all three are there? Did you mean one or the other? Be clear and be specific. Unfortunately, which words are complex and which words are not depends on the field you're practicing in. Here's an example. The system's rejection of exogenous disturbances meets specification. In control theory, if you're designing, say, a controller for a rocket or for an autonomous vehicle, this is perfectly acceptable. Exogenous disturbances are disturbances that come from the outside of the system. The word exogenous is very common in that field. However, if you're just talking about robots, it's very uncommon, and therefore someone who's not familiar with this term would think you're trying to be overly complex. How you get around this problem is to read a lot. Learn the appropriate vocabulary for your field and use it appropriately. Don't try to introduce new terms when an older one is sufficient. Finally, we get to jargon. Jargon are terms that are so technical only experts will understand them. Rarely should they go into a technical report unless you know exactly who will read it, and you know that it will never be read again. In an email or face-to-face conversation is perfectly fine. Jargon is used to simplify that conversation, assuming that everyone in that conversation understands every single piece of jargon. Unfortunately, there's a very large chance of misunderstanding, especially for novices, and it changes very quickly. Here's an example. PDP. It's an acronym, and therefore it's quite a bit of jargon. Here are 3 places you might see this acronym. First of all, notice that the fields are completely different. Packet data protocol is actually something dealing with telephones, like cell phones, but only 2G and 3G networks, which are outdated. It could also mean portable DVD player. That was probably popular during the early 2000s when DVDs were still used. And finally, it might mean program data processor, which is a computer from the 1950s. So if you walk up to an engineer and you say the PDP isn't working, what do you mean? At any time you're using jargon, ask yourself, who is my audience? Sometimes you can't get away from it. You have to use the acronym because you don't want to keep on writing the words packet data protocol or program data processor. If that happens, you should either have a dictionary, something basically at the end of your document that says this term means this, or it should be well introduced and consistently used. Ultimately, if you can avoid jargon, do so.